By the time I found Amelia in the lowest archive corridor, the fire alarm had already stopped sounding. That was the worst part. If it had kept ringing, if the red lights had kept flashing, I could have blamed the panic on noise and smoke and adrenaline. Instead, there was only the low mechanical breathing of the climate system and the wet click of her shoes as she backed away from something I couldn't see. "Lucas," she said, without looking at me. "Don't let him use my voice." The emergency lights washed the hallway in a dim, blood-thin red. Metal shelving stood on both sides under plastic curtains, each row tagged with accession numbers and handwritten warnings. At the far end of the corridor, my father was standing beside the vault door. He looked exactly as he had in the last photograph we had of him. Brown coat, museum badge, one cuff darkened with shellac, hair falling over his forehead because he never remembered to cut it on time. He lifted one hand to me, small and calm, the same gesture he used when he wanted me to stop talking and listen. Behind me, Owen started crying in the helpless, furious way grown men do when they know it won't help. "Lucas," my father said, and his voice came from two places at once. His mouth and somewhere inside the wall. "You only need to tell one of them you trust me." I don't remember deciding to move. I remember Amelia's hand closing on my sleeve. I remember the vault door beginning to open from the inside. And I remember very clearly that when I looked at my father's face the second time, he had my eyes. Started 3 weeks earlier. I took the night security job at the Evergreen Museum of Natural History because I needed money. That was the official version, and it wasn't even false. My savings were low, my landlord had started using the patient voice people use before they become impolite, and I had been doing temp work long enough to know that a full-time position with benefits was not something a sensible person turned down. The unofficial reason was the one I didn't mention in the interview. 20 years earlier, my father had disappeared in that same building. He had been a conservator then, one of the people who repaired damaged specimens and stabilized fragile objects before they went into storage or on display. I was 12 when he vanished. The museum told my mother he had suffered a breakdown during a renovation project under the south wing. They said he walked out in the middle of a shift and was never seen again. There was no note, no body, no confirmed sighting afterward. Just paperwork. Institutional language. Regret without liability. My mother accepted it because she had 2 children and no talent for conspiracy. I never did. Even as a kid, I knew there was something rehearsed about the story. The museum grieved him too efficiently. Evergreen sat on the edge of downtown like an old courthouse somebody had taught to imitate a cathedral. The public floors were familiar enough. Dioramas, mineral halls, mounted skeletons, educational placards with softened corners where generations of children had picked at them. But the employee entrance led into another building entirely, one hidden inside the first. Concrete corridors, service elevators, badge readers, pipe chases, preservation labs smelling faintly of acetone and dust. Underground storage extended farther than the museum map admitted. Several wings had no public designation at all, just letters and numbers stenciled on steel doors. There were 4 of us in that round of hires, all assigned to nights. Amelia Torres had a graduate degree in archaeology and the contained posture of someone who had spent years forcing herself to stay polite in underfunded departments. Owen Markham had worked mall security and kept making jokes that sounded like he was testing a room for structural weakness. Priya Shah had been an EMT before an injury took her out of ambulance work. She moved carefully, with the deliberate economy of someone who knew exactly how much pain she was in and didn't intend to advertise it. Then there was me. Orientation took place in a basement conference room with no windows and a mural of prehistoric ferns painted on one wall badly enough to be sinister by accident. A woman from administration named Ms. Bell gave us tax forms and access cards. Harold Dunn, the veteran night supervisor, stood against the back wall with his arms folded, while she explained the chain of command in a tone so neutral it felt scrubbed. Harold looked like he had been built out of old uniforms. 60, maybe, tall and flat-faced, with a neck that had disappeared into his shoulders from years of bracing himself against bad news. He watched us with open dislike or something close to it. At the time I thought it was contempt for new staff. Later I understood it had been fear. At the end of orientation, Ms. Bell handed each of us a sealed envelope. Zone-specific protocols, she said. Read them before your first patrol and keep them with you at all times. Owen smiled. What is this secret spy stuff? Ms. Bell didn't smile back. Compliance matters. That night, in the locker room, I opened my envelope. Inside was a laminated card with my name, my assigned area, Upper Paleontology, East Corridor, Hall of Extinct Mammals and adjacent service routes, and 4 typed rules. 1. Do not enter the Hall of Extinct Mammals after midnight. 2. If a display appears incomplete, continue walking. 3. Never count the skeletons in Exhibit 12. 4. If a child asks for directions, do not answer. That was all. No explanation, no signature, no departmental letterhead. I read it twice and laughed once under my breath. Not because it was funny, but because the alternatives were irritation and unease. It looked like something made by a committee that had mistaken theatricality for authority. Museums loved internal rituals. Every institution did. It was how old buildings kept themselves feeling important. Amelia came in while I was still looking at the card. You got one too? She asked. I held it up. Apparently, I'm not supposed to help lost children. She frowned. Mine says I should. That got my attention. She showed me her card. Her zone was the fossil restoration wing and adjoining freight hall. Her rules were different. One of them read, if a child appears lost, ask who they came with and escort them to the north desk. We stood there for a few seconds, comparing the cards in silence. Maybe they tailor them to the exhibits, she said. Maybe they tailor them to the intern writing them. But when we found Priya and Owen, theirs were different too. Owen had a rule instructing him to inspect any incomplete display for signs of tampering. Priya had one ordering her never to touch a display that seemed altered, even if it obstructed her path. Amelia's card mentioned a humming sound none of ours referenced. Owen's warned him not to use the service elevator if it arrived already open. Mine said nothing about elevators at all. The contradictions were obvious once we laid them out. That was almost comforting. Obvious contradictions looked human. Human meant manageable. Initiation hazing, Owen said. This place has to find its entertainment somewhere. Priya ran her thumb over the edge of her card. Harold didn't look like he was in on a joke. We started our first shift at 11. Museums changed character after closing in a way I had never appreciated as a visitor. During the day, the building absorbed noise until nothing felt isolated. At night, every room became distinct. You noticed the seams between exhibits, the dark glass of the cases, the pooled light over individual specimens, each one appearing more deliberate and less educational once there were no children pointing at it. My patrol took me along the East Corridor, through mineral exhibits, past marine fossils, and up to the Hall of Extinct Mammals. Before midnight, the hall was unremarkable in the unsettling way well-made taxidermy was unremarkable. Giant sloth, dire wolf, aurochs, reconstructed mammoth skull, all lit from below as if extinction had its own theatrical designer. At 12:07 I reached the threshold and stopped. The hall beyond was dark. Not unlit. Dark. The kind of dark that seemed to occupy space instead of merely filling it. I could still see the emergency exit sign at the far end, but the display lights between had gone out without any corresponding alert on my radio. I remembered Rule 1. I also remembered being 32 years old and standing in a state-chartered museum obeying a laminated card like a child at summer camp. Still, I didn't go in. That decision bothered me more than it should have. Not because I thought I had narrowly avoided anything, but because I had complied before I understood why. I moved on, irritated with myself, and finished my round through the east stairwell and the avian gallery above. Around 1:15 I passed Exhibit 12, which housed Pleistocene predator mounts and 3 articulated skeletons under a single suspended sign. I glanced at them and then away with an odd, immediate reluctance, the same reflex that stops you from looking too long at a stranger who might mistake the attention for challenge. 3 skeletons, I thought. A second later I wasn't sure. At 2:03, near the service corridor behind minerals, I saw what I took to be a child standing by the water fountain. Small frame, dark coat, stillness that wasn't normal in children. My first thought was practical. Somebody's kid left behind during an evening event. My second was the rule. By the time I decided to ask where their parents were, the child had turned and walked through the locked staff door without opening it. I stopped about 10 feet away. The hallway was empty. My own face looked back at me from the dark window panel in the door. I told myself there was a reflection angle I wasn't understanding. I told myself the museum had too many mirrors disguised as glass. I told myself several useful things. At shift change, Harold was waiting near the security office with a clipboard and a styrofoam cup of coffee that smelled like it had been brewed during the Clinton administration. "Any issues?" he asked. I almost mentioned the child. Instead, I heard myself say, "No." He studied me for a moment, not suspiciously, tiredly. "Good," he said. "Keep it that way." It wasn't until I got home and emptied my pockets that I realized my laminated rule card was damp, not with water, with something cold and oily that smelled faintly of wet stone. In the first week, we made the mistake of acting like coworkers. I don't mean that ironically. I mean we did what ordinary people do when placed in an unfamiliar job with inconsistent instructions and an environment that clearly expects quiet obedience. We found each other on breaks. We compared notes. We tried to convert a collection of private discomforts into a manageable shared problem. The museum almost seemed to allow it. Our night shift had a rhythm by then. We arrived before close while families were still pushing strollers through the lobby under the suspended whale. We waited out the last stragglers, watched admissions cash out, listened to the building settle into its after-hours noises. Then the public doors locked, the custodians split off by floor, and the place changed shape around us. It wasn't just silence. Silence in public buildings still carries the memory of daytime noise. Evergreen at night developed selective absences. Corridors that should have echoed didn't. Certain rooms felt acoustically padded, as if the air itself had been thickened. Other spaces amplified tiny sounds, the tick of radiator pipes, the scrape of a shoe sole, until they felt like signals. We started leaving each other notes on a whiteboard in the security office. Case 14 in minerals looked rearranged at 120. Anyone else? North elevator opened by itself twice. Who moved the folding ladder near Bird Hall? Is there always a smell like burned cinnamon in the south stairwell? Most of it could still be filed under old building behavior. Even the stranger things. Especially the stranger things. Once you say a place is old, people will let it get away with a great deal. By the fourth shift, Owen suggested we type up all our rules in one document. "Nothing formal," he said. "Just so we can cross-reference. If half of these contradict each other, maybe there are patterns." Priya gave him a look over the top of her coffee. "You say, patterns like that is a safe word. Would you rather wander around separately obeying random nonsense printed on index cards?" "At the moment," she said. "Maybe." We made the document anyway. Amelia brought her laptop. We sat in the break room beneath a bulletin board full of outdated safety posters and typed out every rule exactly as written. Some were minor variations. Some were so specific they sounded like fragments of an unseen larger procedure. Owen's included. If a display appears incomplete, inspect the accompanying label for misprints before reporting it. Mine said to keep walking. Priya's warned. Do not read labels aloud in Gallery C after 2 o'clock. Amelia had one that read, "If you hear whistling from the restoration sink, leave tools where they are and shut the door." Then there were the direct conflicts. My card. If a child asks for directions, do not answer. Amelia's. If a child appears lost, assist immediately. Owen's. If anyone asks whether the museum is open, say no and continue walking. Priya's. If you are asked whether the museum is alive, do not answer in any language. That last one shut the room up for a second. "That can't be real," Owen said. Priya slid the card across the table. "I copied it exactly." We tried to joke our way through the unease. Institutions develop rituals, we said. Maybe this was legal cover for dealing with mentally ill trespassers. Maybe there had been lawsuits. Maybe Harold got bored and wrote haunted house prompts for all new hires. But the more we compared, the less the contradictions felt random. They clustered around certain themes. Children, incomplete displays, counting, answering questions, naming things, agreeing about what we'd seen. It was Amelia who noticed that last one. "Look at how many of these mention confirming with another guard," she said, scrolling through the file. "Or don't mention it. Mine says if I notice a moved object in restoration, I should not ask another employee whether they moved it." Owen pointed. "I have the opposite. If I notice movement in West storage, I'm supposed to confirm it with the nearest guard before logging it." "That doesn't make sense," I said. "No," Amelia said quietly. "It doesn't. Harold found us on the 6th night. He came into the break room without knocking, which somehow made it feel like he had. Amelia's laptop was open on the table between us. Harold looked at the screen, then at our faces, and for the first time I saw real emotion get through his control. Not anger at first. Something closer to panic. "Who made that?" he asked. Owen leaned back. "It's a spreadsheet, Harold, not a bomb. Delete it." The room held still. "We're just comparing protocols," Amelia said. "They're inconsistent. We thought." "I know what you thought." He stepped forward. "Delete it now." There are moments when authority goes from tedious to suspicious in a single breath. That was one of them. Harold wasn't offended. He was afraid the way people are afraid of live wires and loaded weapons. His eyes kept flicking to the open doorway, as if he expected something to hear us. "Why?" Priya asked. "Because you're not supposed to share them." "That wasn't in my rules," Owen said. Harold rounded on him. "Do not get clever with me." I stood. "If this is some kind of actual safety procedure, then explain it. My father worked here. He disappeared here. People have been lying about this place for 20 years. So if you know something—" Harold cut me off with a look sharp enough to feel physical. "Then you should know better than most that this museum does not improve when people decide they understand it." Nobody spoke. "Delete it," he said again, lower this time. "And if you've printed anything, burn it." It was such an excessive instruction that Owen almost laughed. Then he saw none of us were going to. Amelia closed the laptop without deleting the file. Harold stayed there another second, watching each of us in turn, then left with the rigid, measured pace of someone who wanted to run and knew it would be noticed. After he was gone, Owen exhaled. "Well," Priya looked at the door. "He thinks we're going to get hurt. He thinks we're going to make his life difficult," Owen said. I wasn't sure. The fear on Harold's face hadn't been administrative. That night, I started paying attention to the building in a different way. Not as a workplace with eccentric procedures, but as a system that changed under observation. In the Hall of Extinct Mammals, one of the placards under the giant sloth had been replaced. I was certain of it, though I couldn't have said what the original text had been. In Exhibit 12, the skeletons were arranged differently than I remembered. Not moved, reposed almost. One ribcage angled as if it had turned toward the aisle. At 1:40 my radio crackled and gave a burst of voices too layered to separate, like several conversations played backward through static. Then Amelia's actual voice came through, thin and strained. "Lucas, are you near Palea East? 2 minutes out. Don't come through Mammals," she said. "And if you see anyone in the corridor with me, tell me before I turn around." "Who is with you?" A pause. "That's the problem," she said. When I reached her, she was alone. She stood halfway between the mammoth display and the service door, staring at the polished floor as if it had nearly opened. Her flashlight was trained on a set of muddy footprints that ended 4 feet from the wall. They were too small to belong to an adult. "My rules said if I hear a child crying, I should verify before reporting," she said. "So I came up from restoration. I heard it from this hall." I looked around. The museum was silent. "What did you see?" She swallowed. "Not see. I heard someone walking behind me. Every time I stopped, it stopped. Every time I started, it started. Then I asked if someone was there." Her mouth tightened. "My card doesn't say anything about that. I should have checked the wording." I remembered my own rule about children and didn't mention it. It became easier after that to justify keeping the document. Harold's reaction had changed the nature of it. It was no longer gossip. It was evidence. so we copied our rules by hand onto separate pages. Amelia hid them inside a field guide in restoration. Priya folded hers into the lining of her first aid pouch. Owen put his in a cigarette pack he didn't smoke from. I kept mine in my wallet behind an old photograph of my father in the conservation lab, taken the year before he vanished. He was looking away from the camera in it, one hand braced on a specimen crate, as if someone had called his name just before the shutter clicked. For a while, that was enough. Shared suspicion, private plans, the ordinary cohesion of people who think danger can be solved by teamwork and accurate notes. Looking back, I think the museum liked us best then. We were teaching it how trust worked. The first disaster happened on a Thursday just after 1 in the morning, in the dinosaur gallery on the second floor. I know the time because Owen radioed it in at 1:13 and because I wrote it down afterward 3 different times, trying to make the sequence behave like a sequence. It never really did. The dinosaur gallery stayed cooler than the rest of the museum to protect the mounts, and at night the overhead skeletons cast shadows so large they seemed to move before the bodies that made them. Amelia had been rerouted through there because a maintenance crew had left equipment blocking her usual corridor in restoration. She mentioned that later with the flat precision people use when they know details matter but don't yet know why. She saw a child near the base of the hadrosaur mount. 8 or 9 maybe, blue coat, hands folded, standing alone under a display sign. That much she told us herself, and at the time there was no reason to doubt her. According to Amelia, the child looked up when she approached and asked, in a perfectly calm voice, whether the museum was still alive. That question mattered because Priya had a rule about it, and Amelia didn't. It mattered because my card said not to answer children, and hers said the opposite. It mattered because by the time I arrived, the child was gone. Amelia had radioed for support in a tone that made me move faster than the words themselves. I came through the north stairwell and saw her standing in the middle of the gallery, flashlight down, body angled toward empty space as if someone were still in front of her. "Amelia," I said. She didn't look at me. "I think she's lost." There was no one there. I crossed the floor in 6 steps, took Amelia by the elbow, and pulled her back harder than I meant to. She jerked in surprise. "What are you doing? There's nobody here." She frowned at me with real irritation, the kind born of embarrassment. Then she looked ahead again and the irritation went out of her face in a way I still remember too clearly. Not fear. Disorientation. Like discovering a familiar room had been rotated while you weren't looking. "I was talking to her," she said. The gallery was empty except for us and the skeletons overhead. Owen came in from the west doors a few seconds later, saw Amelia's expression, and stopped joking. Priya followed, slower, one hand on the radio at her shoulder. We checked every adjacent room, every bench alcove, both bathrooms, both stairwells. No child. No visitor. No sign anyone had been in the public galleries after close. The exterior alarms had not tripped. None of the motion alerts showed unusual activity. We might have let it remain an embarrassing misunderstanding if Amelia hadn't insisted we review the security footage. Harold refused at first. He said there had been no breach and no need. We pressed, and eventually he unlocked the monitor station with such obvious reluctance that even Owen didn't needle him. The camera angle over Dinosaur Gallery 2 was wide and slightly elevated. Time stamp in the corner. Amelia entered from the east. She crossed to the center of the room. She stopped. She tilted her head as if listening. Then she spoke. To nobody. She nodded. She bent slightly, the way adults do when addressing children without wanting to loom. She put out one hand toward empty air. When I came in on the recording, I moved straight to her and grabbed her arm. There was nothing between us. Not shadow, not distortion, not any flicker that could be mistaken for a body. Owen swore under his breath. Priya didn't say anything. Amelia watched herself talking to empty space and went very still. Not defensive, not hysterical. Just still, as if she was listening to a verdict being read somewhere far away. Harold closed the playback before it looped. "Go home," he told her. "I'm fine," Amelia said automatically. "No," he said. "Your first stage. Go home." The term landed badly because it implied a scale. Amelia went home. She came back the next night anyway, pale and angry and too proud to stay off shift. At first the change in her was small enough to pass as stress. She paused at doorways as if waiting for people to clear them. She said hello to empty ticket counters. Once, in the break room, she moved her coffee cup to make space for someone setting down a tray, except there was no tray and no person. On the third night after the incident, she stopped beside a taxidermy fox in a corridor case and said, "No, that's not until Thursday." Priya was standing next to her at the time. She heard the sentence clearly. When she asked Amelia who she'd been answering, Amelia looked at her with baffled offense and said, "The woman from shipping." There was no woman from shipping. That was when even Owen stopped treating the rules as hazing. We began comparing not just the cards, but the consequences of following them. My card had warned me against answering children. Amelia's had instructed her to help them. She followed hers and nearly stepped into something mine might have helped me avoid. Owen had once obeyed his rule about inspecting incomplete displays and found a case in Northwest Birds standing open with all the specimens facing outward, beaks pointed toward the aisle. Priya, who had been told not to touch altered displays, later passed the same case and found it locked, undisturbed, and catalogued as if it had never moved. The rules weren't wrong exactly. They were local, conditional, personal. Following someone else's could expose you to whatever yours were designed to route you around. It turned cooperation from a strength into a contamination risk. None of us said that right away. We circled it with softer language. Zone-specific interactions. Context-dependent triggers. Maybe it keys off the first response. Harold listened to us from the edge of the office and looked older every night. He refused to explain first stage, but I pieced together my own definition. First stage meant recognition drift, seeing people who weren't there, hearing voices from unoccupied rooms, treating displays as if they had social presence. Not madness exactly, more like social instincts being redirected toward the wrong objects. What unsettled me most was how plausible it all remained while you were inside it. Amelia never acted like a person under attack. She acted like a person navigating a world slightly more populated than everyone else's. That made it harder to challenge. She wasn't ranting. She wasn't hallucinating spiders or blood or impossible geometry. She was being polite to absences. Once, in the fossil prep lab, I found her standing before a half-cleaned ceratopsian skull with her hands clasped. "What are you doing?" I asked. She looked over with mild surprise. "Waiting." "For what?" She turned back to the skull. It was in the middle of something. There are sentences that only become frightening after you've walked away from them. That was one. We tried to help her by limiting shared patrols. The logic was clumsy but sincere. If the rules were personal, then we should stop borrowing each other's behavior. Stay in our lanes. Stop cross-referencing in the moment. Report incidents separately. That lasted less than 2 shifts, because the building didn't respect lanes. An object missing from Amelia's wing would appear in mine. A temperature alert in storage would correspond with a sound in public galleries. Priya would note a locked door at 0:40 and Owen would find it open at 0:43 from the other side. The museum was not divided by our assignments as neatly as the cards pretended. Whatever system generated those instructions knew enough to isolate us, but not enough to keep the effects contained. Late one night, I asked Harold if my father had ever received rules. He stared at me for so long I thought he hadn't heard. "Everyone on nights gets rules," he said. "Did he disappear because he broke them?" Harold rubbed a hand over his mouth. "People don't disappear because they break them. Then why do they disappear?" His eyes shifted past me toward the dark monitor bank. "Because sometimes," he said, "they start thinking the rules mean the same thing to everybody." That answer enraged me because it sounded like wisdom while explaining nothing. It also frightened me because Harold believed it. The next night, Amelia greeted a group of schoolchildren in the lobby at 2:10 a.m. There were no children there. The lobby cameras confirmed that too. Afterward, when she realized what she'd done, she sat in the first aid room with Priya and asked a question none of us knew how to answer. "How do I know my own rules are still mine?" No one spoke for a while. Finally Owen said, "Maybe we stop comparing. Period." I looked at Amelia, at the strain in her face, at the effort it took her not to glance toward the empty chair by the wall as if someone she knew was sitting in it. Everything in me resisted the idea of separating. Felt like surrender. It felt like giving the building exactly what it wanted. But I had seen the footage. And for the first time since taking the job, I considered that collaboration itself might not be neutral here. It might be the mechanism. Once we understood that the rules could hurt as easily as help, our small group stopped feeling like a team and started feeling like a chemistry experiment. We still met, but with caution now. We stopped reading our cards aloud. We stopped finishing each other's accounts of strange incidents. We began speaking around details in a way that felt paranoid even when it was justified. Something happened near my stairwell. One of us would say, "People-shaped?" Another might ask, "No, object-related." Or, "Did anyone else have changes in labels tonight? Don't tell me the wording. Just yes or no." The museum encouraged this awkwardness by getting worse in ways that punished confidence. Exhibits changed overnight. Not dramatically enough to trigger administrative response, or not administrative response that reached us. A specimen missing from inventory would appear under a new accession tag. Cases acquired objects no one remembered transporting. A carved mask I had passed a dozen times in anthropology suddenly had a description card referring to a donor I later discovered did not exist in the database. Harold called these clerical blooms, with a bitterness that suggested the phrase had been coined by someone he hated. The skeletons were worse. It started with Exhibit 12 because of my rule, though maybe that only meant I was primed to notice it. Exhibit 12 occupied a long room branching off Pleistocene predators, and it contained mounted remains from several interlocking digs, dire wolf, cave bear, an oversized cat species still under debate, and a row of partial human-adjacent finds from a site in the Northwest Basin. The display wasn't popular during the day because it didn't have obvious centerpieces. At night, it felt concentrated, as if the room had been built around an argument. The first time I tested myself, I stood in the doorway and counted the articulated skeletons without moving my lips. For I thought, then I blinked and there were 5. Not because one appeared, because I could no longer decide whether one of the partial reconstructions near the rear wall counted as a skeleton or a framework for one. My eyes kept reclassifying the shapes. I walked away with a pressure behind my forehead like the start of a migraine. When I asked Owen how many skeletons were in 12, he said 3 immediately, then narrowed his eyes at me. "You counted, didn't you? You just did too." "No," he said. "I remembered." Priya, overhearing us, said there were 7 if you included the suspended juveniles, which neither of us had mentioned because neither of us had noticed any suspended juveniles at all. Amelia refused to answer. She just looked sick. The point wasn't that one of us was wrong. The point was that all of us sounded sincere. The rule had not protected me from a dangerous number. It had protected me from participating in a disagreement the room wanted. Soon the incompatibilities became practical. Owen discovered that if a display case appeared open in his section, checking the lock sometimes made the feeling of being watched recede. Priya found the opposite. If she acknowledged altered displays physically, the sensation intensified and usually spread to the next room. Amelia, on nights when she was clear enough to discuss it, admitted there were hallways she could pass through safely only if she answered voices the rest of us had learned to ignore. Each adaptation threatened somebody else. One shift I followed Owen through West Storage after he told me, carefully, that walking the central aisle helped in his zone when the overhead lights began to hum. 10 feet in, every shelf tag on my left side flipped upside down at once. Not physically. I mean, I looked at them and knew, with nauseating certainty, that if I read any of them I would recognize my own handwriting. I backed out so fast I nearly fell. Another time Priya stopped Amelia from touching a display crate in transit staging because it seemed warm in a way Priya had learned to distrust. Amelia later insisted the crate had been calling her name in my father's voice. I told myself that last part didn't matter to me more than the others. It did. Eventually Harold admitted something. Not everything. Nothing like everything. But enough to prove he had been withholding more than procedure. We cornered him in the monitor room after a night when 2 exhibits had changed placement between camera sweeps with no recorded movement. He looked exhausted enough to be almost honest. "Several years ago," he said, "the museum acquired a collection from an archaeological site that should have stayed buried." Owen folded his arms. "That is not a sentence actual professionals use unless they want to get punched." Harold ignored him. "Remote excavation. Private donors. Incomplete provenance by the time it reached us. Crates came in mixed. Human remains, animal remains, things nobody could classify cleanly. Some of it looked reconstructed already. Not by conservators. By whoever packed it." Amelia asked, "And the rules started then?" Harold hesitated. "Soon after. Why not shut the place down?" Harold gave a short, ugly laugh. "Because it didn't look like a shut the place down problem. It looked like inconsistent reports from night staff. Missing tools. Mislabeling. Then one man said a diorama had spoken to him. Another said he'd seen a coworker in a room she'd never entered. By the time administration understood there was a pattern, they already had 3 different descriptions of the pattern." "Who made the rules?" I asked. "Everybody," he said. "That's part of the problem." He would say no more, but it was enough to rearrange the past few weeks. The rules weren't ancient lore. They were recent, evolving, a workplace adaptation to something nobody fully understood and nobody wanted to name in a funding report. Which meant the danger was still learning. That night I went lower than my assigned route for the first time, using my badge on a stairwell door that should have denied access and didn't. The basement under the public floors smelled less like dust and more like refrigeration, wet concrete, old paper, and preservation chemicals. The corridors down there were narrower. Pipe insulation yellowed with age. Directional signs had been painted over and repainted so many times the arrows looked uncertain. I found locked labs, sealed storage, and one wire mesh partition behind which sat a row of specimen crates with their original shipping marks sanded off. On a shelf nearby, tucked behind a broken humidity gauge, was a field notebook with the museum logo embossed on the cover. I thought, immediately and without evidence, of my father. It wasn't his notebook. Not that one. The handwriting belonged to a former preparator named Elise Werner, according to the inside cover. But the entries inside were familiar in a newly awful way. Dates, patrol notes, copied rules, revisions, cross-outs, escalating frustration. Rule 2 only works if I don't say it aloud first. Mark sees children. I see old women. Stop comparing. The building is not haunted. It is iterative. Do not let 2 people agree on what moved. Several pages later, underlined twice. The museum learns through consensus. I read that line 5 times. When I showed the notebook to the others the next night, we did not discuss it in the open office. We took it to the loading dock stairwell where the concrete sweated and the cameras occasionally fuzzed without recording static. "What does that mean?" Owen asked. Amelia answered before anyone else. "It means every time we decide on one version of an event, something gets easier for it." "It," Priya said quietly, not questioning the pronoun. I thought of the way our shared rule document had felt so sensible, so stabilizing. I thought of Harold's panic when he saw it. The museum learns through consensus. Not through fear, maybe. Not through death. Through agreement. I went home at dawn and couldn't sleep. Around 10 in the morning, I took out the old box of my father's things my mother had given me years earlier and never fully sorted. Most of it was ordinary receipts, conservation manuals, snapshots from staff picnics, a tie he must have hated. At the bottom was a photograph I had forgotten. My father in a hard hat during the renovation, standing beside a temporary barrier with sublevel access restricted stenciled on it. Behind him, half obscured, was Harold. 20 years younger and looking directly at the camera with the same expression he'd worn in the break room when he told us to destroy the spreadsheet. That afternoon, before my shift, I put the photograph in my wallet beside the rule card. I had stopped pretending this job was only about rent. If my father had learned what the museum was, then somewhere in that building there had to be a record of what it had done to him, or of what he had done to survive it. By the 3rd week, the question wasn't whether the museum was dangerous. The question was whether knowing each other made us more so. Owen argued for separation first. We were in the freight antechamber near restoration, standing among dollies and covered crates while the air system throbbed overhead. Amelia had had a better night, meaning only 2 instances of talking to absent people, neither of which escalated. So all of us were pretending that counted as progress. "This is not complicated," Owen said. "Every time we pool information, things get more accurate, more personal. We stop talking, we starve it." Priya leaned against a metal table with her arms folded. "We also stop helping each other. Helping each other is what's feeding it." "No," I said. "Sharing indiscriminately is feeding it. That's different." Owen looked at me with open disbelief. "You hear yourself? We've become the kind of people who say indiscriminately about being in danger together." He wasn't wrong, which made it harder to dismiss him. We had more journals by then. Once we knew what to look for: hidden notebooks, copied rule cards, incident logs tucked behind old manuals. We found evidence of former night staff all over the lower levels. Some had been intentionally concealed. Others looked abandoned in haste. No two agreed entirely. Each author treated a different behavior as essential. Some swore humming to yourself in certain corridors helped. Others warned that making noise drew attention. One insisted reflections were safer than direct sight. Another wrote in increasingly shaky pen, "Mirrors are consensus with yourself. Avoid them when possible." But one warning recurred often enough to feel less like panic and more like a pattern. "The museum learns through consensus. Agreement is a bridge. Do not give it a stable version of events." I wanted to believe this offered strategy. In reality, it offered only a principle, and principles don't tell you what to do when someone you know is bleeding or calling your name from the wrong side of a locked door. My father's journal turned up 2 nights later. I found it in sublevel storage behind a shelf of unprocessed casts, wedged between a rolled fire blanket and a cracked transport case. The notebook was a standard conservation log, water warped along one edge, with his initials inside the cover in the quick angular script I knew from old birthday cards. I sat on the floor and read half of it there. The early entries were procedural: humidity readings, repairs, complaints about mislabeled shipments from the excavation. Then the tone shifted by degrees so small they would have been invisible if I didn't know where it ended. New advisory protocol from night supervisor. Contradictory by department. Probably temporary. Harold says not to discuss the changes in mammals. He looked ill when he said it. One of the basin frames now resembles a previous preparator. No one agrees which one. Eli says we need standardization. I think standardization may be the issue. Page after page of copied rules, modified rules, rejected rules. Some were crossed out with such force the paper had torn. If addressed by a familiar voice in Collections B, do not turn immediately. Crossed out. If addressed by a familiar voice, ask it to identify itself. Crossed out harder. If you hear your name from behind sealed storage, leave the floor. Circled, then crossed out. Near the end, the handwriting deteriorated. It isn't copying bodies. It's copying consensus about bodies. The displays are rehearsal. We made the mistake of agreeing. That final line took up the entire page. I closed the notebook and sat there for a long time with my father's words in my hands, hearing nothing but the ductwork and my own pulse. There are kinds of grief that remain abstract until they acquire method. My father had not simply vanished. He had participated in something, resisted something, or failed at something specific enough to write down. That made the loss sharper, not easier. I showed the journal to the others in pieces, not all at once. That was a habit we had developed without discussing it. Partial disclosure, delayed detail, careful omission. The kind of behavior that would destroy trust anywhere else. Here it was survival etiquette. Amelia read the line we made the mistake of agreeing and closed the notebook carefully, almost respectfully. Plural, she said. He wasn't alone. No, I said. Harold, when confronted, went gray around the mouth. You knew he left records, I said. I knew some people did. Did my father disappear? Harold looked tired enough to tell the truth badly. Depends what you mean. That answer nearly made me hit him. Priya stepped between us before I had fully moved. Not now. Harold rubbed his forehead. Your father was part of a team trying to standardize response protocols after the first major incident cluster. Conservators, security, admin. They thought if everyone followed the same rules, the contradictions would stop. For a few nights, it worked. Worked. The ugliest word in the language. And then, I asked, and then the imitations improved. He said it flatly, without ornament. That made it worse. People started seeing the same figures in the same places, hearing the same voices, the same dead relatives, the same missing staff, the same misremembered conversations. Once it got stable enough, it started anticipating, intercepting. Your father was one of the last to argue they needed to break protocol again. What happened to him? Harold met my eyes, then looked away. He went below the restricted vault with 2 others. Only one came back. That one wouldn't say what happened, and after a week he stopped existing on paper. Took me a moment to understand the phrasing. Stopped existing how? Harold's voice was almost inaudible. Records changed. Badge logs. Payroll. We remembered him, but the institution didn't. Nobody spoke. The museum learns through consensus. I understood then that Owen's argument for separation wasn't cowardice. It was a sane reaction to a system that used cooperation as scaffolding. Still, the idea of splitting completely filled me with a more personal dread. Not because I was noble, because I had spent 20 years with a father-shaped absence. I had no interest in repeating that by choice, watching people get erased one at a time because isolation happened to be tactically sound. We don't separate, I said. Owen stared at me. You cannot be serious. We stop comparing interpretations. We stop merging data. But we don't abandon each other. That sounds good, he said. Because it is emotionally satisfying, not because it is true. Maybe. Amelia spoke before he could continue. He's not wrong. We both looked at her. She had been drifting in and out of attention all night, eyes tracking things none of us could see. Now she sounded clear. If the museum learns through consensus, she said, then it probably also learns through repeated abandonment. Pattern matters here. Maybe trust is dangerous in one way and isolation is dangerous in another. Priya nodded slowly. Collaborate on action, not on explanation. Owen gave a short, hopeless laugh. Great. We'll invent a new branch of disaster. Maybe we did. Maybe all we managed was choosing a form of damage that felt less shameful. Near dawn, after the others dispersed to finish their rounds, I sat alone in the lower storage corridor with my father's journal open to the last pages. Several sheets had been glued together by moisture or intent. I separated them carefully with a scalpel from a nearby bench. Between 2 stuck pages was a folded slip of paper not in my father's hand. On it, in cramped pencil, were 6 words. Trust is how it enters groups. Nothing else. No signature. I put the paper in my wallet and felt, for the first time since taking the job, that I was no longer investigating the museum from the outside. I had inherited someone's unfinished argument with it. Once Harold finally admitted that the rules were barriers rather than protections, the museum stopped pretending it was indifferent to our understanding. That was the week the imitations became intimate. Before then, most anomalies had retained some institutional distance. Wrong children in public galleries, altered labels, unrecorded movement, voices that might be vents until they used your name. You could still tell yourself the building was generating conditions rather than personalities. Then the fossils started resembling people we knew. The first clear instance happened in restoration. Amelia called Priya down to verify damage to a partially cleaned skull from the basin collection. Priya took one look and told me later she nearly dropped her flashlight. The skull had not changed shape exactly. The measurements remained the same. The cranial ridges, the fractures, the catalog notes all matched. Yet the facial geometry had shifted just enough that if you looked at it from the prep table angle, it resembled Amelia's deceased grandmother. Not metaphorically. Not in the loose way strangers occasionally resemble relatives. It had her compressed mouth, her asymmetrical brow, the same stubborn set around the eye sockets. Priya told no one but me that night. Amelia had seen it first and backed out of the lab without speaking. By morning she was insisting she had overreacted and the resemblance was gone. 2 shifts later, Owen encountered a funerary statue in anthropology that now had his missing brother's nose. He didn't tell us until he had already smashed the case glass. Officially, the incident report said he had found evidence of tampering. Harold buried the rest. I helped Owen clean blood from his knuckles in the first aid room while he kept repeating, with furious embarrassment, "It wasn't him. I know it wasn't him. I know," I said. It smiled before I hit it. I didn't answer because I couldn't say whether I believed him and because belief had become a dangerous thing to offer. For me, it was my father. Not all at once. The museum was too cautious for that by then. At first, it was fragments. A profile reflected in case glass. A hand disappearing around a corner with the familiar bend in the ring finger my father had broken when I was 6. A coat hanging on a hook in sublevel storage that matched the one from the old photograph in my wallet. Then came the voice, always from one room farther away than I could immediately access. Lucas. Not pleading. Not threatening. Calm. As if we were in the same house and he needed me to carry something. I never answered. I never said his name aloud in the building after that first week. Even so, the sightings improved. Took me several days to understand why. Then I realized we had been talking about him more. Not only him. Everyone's dead, missing, or absent people had entered our conversations in defensive fragments. My grandmother, my brother, someone from shipping, Professor Amelia lost during field school, Priya's former partner from ambulance work, dead 3 years. We had been trying not to share, but grief is pattern-shaped. Once you know somebody else's point of weakness, even politely, you provide outline and pressure. The museum learned from shared information. The next time we met, Harold said it plainly. We were in the security office with the monitor bank dark except for 3 camera feeds Harold kept on even during failures. Lobby, freight elevator, South Service Hall. He looked more defeated than authoritative. The rules were never meant to keep you safe, he said. Not really. They were meant to keep you from teaching it too quickly. No one spoke. He went on. At first everybody wrote their own workarounds. Personal habits, avoidances, little superstitions. Some of those reduced incidents. Management gathered them, redistributed them by zone, edited out overlap. That bought time. People thought the rules were magic. They weren't. They were information barriers. Why not tell us that from the start? Priya asked. Harold gave her a grim look. Because people do not reliably handle your coworkers, maybe the delivery system, well, on orientation day. Owen laughed once, without humor. Fair. Harold sat heavily in the desk chair, all his stiffness collapsing for a moment. You think I liked being the bastard who told every new hire not to compare notes? I did it because every time a staff got too collaborative, the imitations sharpened. Shared language gives it structure. Shared confidence gives it entry points. Amelia, who had been staring at the inactive monitor glass, said, It wants relationships more than bodies. Harold looked at her. Yes. The word settled in the room like a second atmosphere. Relationships. Not blood. Not even presence, maybe. Recognition. Trust. Social certainty. The thing under the museum, whatever collective intelligence had formed around those incomplete remains, was using exhibits, artifacts, labels, and us as a training set. It wasn't reconstructing anatomy. It was reconstructing personhood badly and getting better. I thought of my father's journal. It isn't copying bodies. It's copying consensus about bodies. That line clarified too much. After that, our attempts at communication became almost ceremonial in their care. We used notebooks to relay logistical facts without interpretation. We avoided names when possible. We stopped telling one another who we had seen in altered displays. That restraint felt both necessary and cruel. I knew Owen was suffering because he stopped joking completely. I knew Amelia's condition was worsening because she had begun leaving pauses in conversation, as if making room for someone else's reply. I knew Priya was frightened because she became gentler when she spoke, and fear had that effect on her instead of the opposite. As for me, I started finding traces of my father in places only I should have understood. A correction in red pencil on an old catalog sheet, using his habit of crossing sevens with a slash. A repaired specimen seam in the exact adhesive style he taught his interns. A folded rag in a conservation drawer tied the way he tied them, once around and once back through, because he said knots that seemed complete usually weren't. Any one of those could have been coincidence. Together they felt like bait with a family history. The night everything tilted, I heard my father whistling. He used to whistle one measure of the same tune whenever he was concentrating and didn't know someone was listening. Not a song I ever identified. Just 4 notes, descending, repeated. I heard it from behind the locked door to sublevel archive Annex C at 2:18 a.m. I stood there so long my radio check tone went off twice. Then my father's voice, from the other side of the steel. Lucas, don't bring Harold. I left immediately, not because I was brave, because the sentence contained too much intelligence. It didn't ask for help. It managed social variables. When I reported only that Annex C had vocal activity, Harold's face changed in a way I couldn't place until later. Not surprise. Recognition and dread together, the expression of someone seeing an old tactic reused. He took me aside afterward. If it sounds like your father, he said, assume it's learned your restraint from you. That sentence doesn't mean anything. It means the longer you refuse it, the more specific it's going to become. What happened to him? I asked again. Harold's jaw tightened. I think he made a choice. What choice? He didn't answer. The answer came from the journal instead. That night, back in the lower stacks, I found the final hidden pages I had missed before. My father had pasted 2 sheets together near the end. Inside, written smaller than the rest, almost as if he didn't want the words to continue existing once read, was a single rule. If you want to survive, give it someone who trusts you. Underneath, in a different pen, one later line. I don't know if this is instruction or confession. I read it until the meaning lost edges and became pure nausea. The museum didn't merely learn through consensus. Privileged betrayal. Trust wasn't only data. It was access. Every survivor Harold had hinted at. Every missing employee. Every altered record. The pattern of people persisting while others vanished. Suddenly a shape emerged that I had resisted because it implicated the living more than the dead. What if no one got out of this place clean? What if my father hadn't abandoned us, and hadn't simply been taken? What if he had survived long enough to buy that survival with somebody else's certainty? When I returned upstairs, Amelia was standing in the hall of extinct mammals before midnight, which violated my rules and hers alike. She was looking at the mammoth skull as if listening to it breathe. Amelia, I said. Without turning, she asked, if you found him, would you know whether he was still yours? I didn't answer, because by then I wasn't sure the question was only about my father. The fire alarm began at 1:56 with no corresponding heat signature on any panel. That alone would have been enough to make us suspicious. False mechanical events were not uncommon by then. Door releases without pressure change, elevator calls from sealed floors, temperature alarms in empty rooms. But the alarm in the underground archives came paired with something we hadn't seen before. The emergency override disengaged the lower magnetic locks. Sections that should have remained compartmentalized opened at once. Owen was in West Storage. Priya was near the freight corridor. Amelia had gone down to restoration against Harold's instructions because she claimed something there was calling attendance. Harold was on his way to the panel room when the South Archive shutters closed halfway and jammed, trapping 3 people below. The radios erupted in layered voices. Some were ours. Some were not. I caught pieces. Smoke in sea level. Not smoke. Dust. Don't use names. Lucas, come alone. That last one was my father again. Clean as daylight through the static. Harold grabbed my arm as I moved toward the south stairs. We don't all go. 3 people are trapped. Exactly. It was obscene, but I understood him immediately. A group rescue would be the richest possible informational event. Shared intent, shared fear, shared route, shared interpretation of danger. It would let the museum refine all of us at once. Then what? I said. Pick one to save? His silence answered too quickly. I pulled free. Tell me no one has done that before. Harold's face became very old. It wasn't confession exactly. More like a door in him opening because the structure holding it shut had failed. Every previous survivor, he said, walked out because somebody else trusted them long enough to stay put. The corridor felt suddenly colder, though that may have been shock. Priya was on the radio somewhere below, voice clipped and controlled in the way she used when treating patients. Owen was swearing continuously, which meant he was scared enough to forget performance. Amelia had gone silent. I thought of the hidden rule in my father's journal. If you want to survive, give it someone who trusts you. Did my father do it? I asked. Harold looked at me with a kind of pity I would have preferred anger. I don't know. I know he came back from the lower vault once after 2 others didn't. I know after that he argued nobody should work in teams anymore. I know a week later he was gone. That wasn't an answer, but it was close enough to one to injure. The fire alarm cut out. The silence afterward felt occupied. Owen came through on the radio, too loud. Something is moving in the shelving. I need. Then the transmission warped and repeated his own voice back to him half a second late. Priya's voice broke in. Do not follow voices. Use floor markings only. Lucas, if that's you at the barrier, don't come through the left side. I was not at the barrier. Harold heard it too. We looked at each other. This is how it does it, he said. It turns trust into routing. Every instinct in me split then. One part wanted immediate action. Another wanted to lock every door and wait for daylight, as if daylight had ever truly mattered here. Beneath both was the older wound, the possibility that my father had stood in a similar corridor and made a decision that defined the rest of my life. If he had sacrificed someone to survive, I hated him. If he had refused and still found some worse compromise, I hated the place for forcing the distinction into existence. Amelia's voice returned at last, very soft over the radio. Lucas, there's a door below restoration with your father's handwriting on it. Harold closed his eyes. Don't tell him that, he said, but too late. Where? I asked. I can't read the whole thing, she said. The letters change when I look at them, but I know it's his. I know it. Owen shouted in the background. Something metallic crashed. This is the point in stories where the right choice becomes visible. In life it rarely does. What you get is a moral field so crowded with consequences that every path looks contaminated. Harold spoke low and fast. Listen to me. If you want any of them to come out, you need uncertainty. Not bravery. Not loyalty. Confusion. Split routes. No shared story. Do not make promises. Do not let them rely on one another too cleanly. I almost laughed at the obscenity of it. You're telling me to save them by making them mistrust me. I'm telling you the museum opens where people lean. That line stayed with me because it was both monstrous and, in context, probably true. I made my choice then, though not all at once. Not to betray someone. Not exactly. But to refuse the comfort of the group as a single body. To try the rescue in fragments with incomplete knowledge, risking misunderstanding over stable coordination. It was the opposite of every ordinary emergency principle I knew, and Priya later told me it took everything in her not to fight it. I radioed each of them separately. To Owen, I said, move only if the aisle numbers decrease. To Priya, ignore aisle numbers. Follow the red tape line. To Amelia, do not look for written instructions. Listen for the dehumidifier and walk away from it. All true in local ways, I hoped. None globally reconcilable. Harold stared at me. You think that's enough? No, I said. I think it's better than choosing who to feed it. He nodded once, a grim acknowledgement more than approval, and took the manual release lever for the south shutter. Together we went down. The lower archive levels were built for storage, not occupancy. Narrow aisles, rolling stacks, vapor barriers, low ceilings webbed with conduit. Emergency lights painted everything the wrong color. The smell of scorched dust hung in the air, though I never found actual flame. Instead, there were heat blooms in isolated patches, as if stress itself had raised the temperature. At the first junction, we split without discussion. Harold went toward the panel bypass. I took the restoration corridor. The building began talking immediately, not words at first, footsteps ahead matching my pace. The squeal of a cart will I associated with my father because he used to complain about it. Then voices sampled from memory with increasing accuracy. My mother asking if I was eating properly. Owen laughing from a room I knew he wasn't in. Amelia saying my name with exhausted tenderness. My father's whistle. I didn't answer. I didn't run either. Running implies commitment to a map. At the half-jammed shutter near Annex C, Priya emerged from the wrong direction with dust in her hair and a bleeding scrape along one forearm. You gave Owen different instructions, she said. Yes. For a second I thought she might hit me. Then she nodded once. Good. That was the first time I believed we might still be ourselves at the end of the night. We found Owen near collapsed shelving, furious and pale, dragging an access cart like a shield. He had seen his brother twice and trusted neither sighting, which in that place counted as strength. Amelia took longest. We heard her before we saw her, speaking in low polite murmurs to something around the corner. When she came into view, she was alone. I found the door, she said. The one with his writing. Harold had rejoined us by then. Where? Amelia looked at all of us, and for one terrible moment I thought she was about to tell the story cleanly, give the museum a single route through us. Instead she smiled in a small, broken way and said, Depends which of you asks. That answer saved us, or at least kept us moving long enough to reach the deeper level together, fractured but not unified, uncertain enough to remain difficult. Beyond the final service gate was the vault my father had tried to name in pieces. The truth of the museum waited there. The lowest storage level was not on any map I ever saw. There was a freight door beneath restoration that opened only after Harold overrode 2 deadbolts and a mechanical latch disguised as part of the climate housing. Behind it lay a descending ramp of poured concrete older than the museum above, or at least finished by different hands. The walls narrowed as we went down. The air turned colder, damp in a mineral way, as if the hill under the city had been cut open and persuaded to host paperwork. At the bottom sat a sealed archaeological vault. Not dramatic, not occult-looking, a practical room made terrible by use. Reinforced door, accession labels, transport pallets, work tables, dehumidifiers, portable flood lamps. The kind of space built to convince donors their specimens were receiving scientific care. The moment we entered, every explanation I'd carried, even the strange ones, became insufficient. The source was not a creature in any ordinary sense. Not a single artifact either. It was a structure assembled on several steel frames in the center of the room, surrounded by open crates and documentation binders gone soft with age. Multiple excavation shipments had been unpacked and partially reconstructed together. Human remains, animal remains, fragments that belonged to neither category cleanly. Mandibles joined to vertebral chains that couldn't support them. Partial rib sets nested like repeated attempts. Long bones cut and pinned in comparative clusters. Half-clean skulls mounted beside casts of faces taken from no recognized species. Some pieces were genuine specimen material. Others were plaster, wire, archival foam, resin fills, conservation placeholders. The scaffolding of reconstruction left visible where it should have been removed. That was what made it unbearable. It wasn't a finished horror. It was process, inquiry, reassembly as appetite. There are things the mind rejects not because they are grotesque but because they imply a method you don't want applied anywhere near identity. That structure had been built by people trained to restore, classify, and complete. Somewhere in the museum's history, incomplete remains from multiple sites had been brought together for study and provisional reconstruction. The provisional part had never ended. It had become the phenomenon. Amelia stopped first. It's a collective, she said, voice shaking. Not anatomical, referential. Priya gave her a sharp look, but the words held. All around the room stood the evidence of training. Visitor audio surveys, exhibit drafts, Old interpretive signage, educational scripts, facial approximation notes, behavior studies attached to display planning, public museum work, all of it. The institutional practice of making fragments legible to strangers. Every exhibit upstairs had been feeding this room. Every name plaque, every reconstruction, every explanatory label that turned partial material into a stable story. Every visitor pointing and saying, "It looks like this. It must have been that." Consensus as nourishment. Harold moved to a side table where a stack of accession files sat under plastic sheeting. He pulled one free with visible reluctance. "The Basin Collection," he said. They thought the shipments were contaminated with mixed remains and reconstruction debris from local handling. Conservation teams were told to sort and stabilize. Then the report started. "Why keep any of it?" Owen asked. Harold gave him a stare that contained 30 years of institutional cowardice. "Because museums do not know how to admit that their core function might be the problem." On the far wall hung photographs from the original intake, tables of bones and fragments arranged for cataloging. In every image, the composition shifted slightly between shots. Not enough to trigger notice if you weren't looking for it. Enough that, once seen, you could never be sure whether the differences were human rearrangement or something more patient. I found my father's handwriting on a clipboard near the central frame. Not recent, not miraculous, just old annotations in red pencil on conservation diagrams. Do not complete speculative joins. Separate by site even if morphology overlaps. No composite display without independent verification. Lower down, added later and harder. Stop naming resemblance. I put a hand on the board to steady myself and felt, absurdly, like a child again, arriving after the argument had already happened, trying to understand adults from the wreckage of their decisions. Amelia moved around the central structure with terrible concentration. I saw her almost recognize her grandmother in one arrangement of facial fragments and force herself to look away before the resemblance settled. Owen kept turning in place as if expecting one of the mounted partial skulls to address him in his brother's voice. Priya closed binders as soon as she opened them, refusing to read descriptions aloud. Harold looked like a man standing in the room where he'd spent years failing. The structure itself did not move. That needs saying. We kept expecting animation because our instincts wanted something simpler. No single body rose from the frame. No monster unfolded. The intelligence was in relation, not locomotion. In juxtaposition. In the way the room arranged certainty around us if we provided enough of it. One flood lamp flickered. For an instant, I saw my father standing on the far side of the frames. I looked away immediately, not out of discipline alone, out of comprehension. By then I understood that recognition was participation. "What do we do?" Owen asked, sounding younger than I had ever heard him. Destroy, it would have been the obvious answer in a lesser story. Burn the remains. Collapse the vault. Salt the earth. But the museum above had already distributed the pattern through exhibits, records, staff habits, public memory. This room was source and engine, yes, but not the whole machine. Harold said, "We stopped making sense of it together." Priya let out a breath that might have been a laugh if anything there had been funny. "That's your plan. It's the only one I've seen work." My father had known that too. The journals had all circled the same principle from different directions. Standardization strengthened it. Disagreement slowed it. Contradiction, ambiguity, refusal to settle on a shared account. Those weren't failures of understanding here. They were defenses. So we did the most unnatural thing possible in a crisis. We refused consensus. Not theatrically, methodically. When Owen said, "There are 3 main frames," Priya answered, "No." When Amelia whispered, "That skull looks human," I said, "Don't name it." When Harold started to say the Basin Collection had begun it, Owen cut in, "You don't know that." We stopped completing each other's sentences. Stopped validating perceptions. Stopped aligning the room into a single structure with a single origin and single intent. The effect was subtle at first. The pressure in the vault changed. Not lessened, exactly. It became erratic. The imitative pull weakened when denied shared reinforcement. Faces in the fragments lost coherence from one angle to the next. The resemblance to people we knew slipped, returned, slipped again. Confusion was the first thing that had felt like leverage. I found another note in my father's hand tucked inside a crate inventory. Cannot inhabit what will not stabilize. That was as close to instruction as he had left. We used it. Harold shut down 2 of the flood lamps to create inconsistent sightlines. Priya removed label cards from the nearest specimen trays and pocketed them without reading them. Owen rotated one comparison board face down because it contained side-by-side facial approximation sketches. Amelia, fighting whatever half-social spell the room kept casting over her, began covering accession numbers with strips of conservation tape so we could not easily correlate crates to frames. I took the central interpretive draft from the table, the document intended someday to explain the composite finds to donors or researchers, and tore it straight down the middle. Nothing dramatic followed. No scream from the walls. No convulsion from the frames. Instead, the room became harder to hold in memory. That frightened me more. As we backed toward the ramp, I tried to keep track of the arrangement in the vault and found I could no longer say how many major structures there were, or whether certain fragments had ever been connected. My notes from later prove I retained details, but not stable ones. Even now, I can describe the logic better than the shape. At the threshold, I made one mistake. I looked back hoping, not believing but hoping, to see my father plainly one last time among the frames. I did see him, or something that had learned enough of him to punish the hope. He stood beside the central rack, one hand lifted in the same quiet gesture from the old photograph. This time I did not go to him. I said, to no one in particular, "I don't know who that is." And for the first time in that room, the imitation hesitated. We sealed the vault as best we could. It felt temporary because everything there was temporary. But temporary mattered. Confusion mattered. Refusal mattered. When we reached the upper levels again, dawn was beginning to gray the skylights over the lobby. No one said we'd won. The museum was still above us, full of labels and displays and visitors yet to come. But for the first time since I started, it seemed possible that survival here depended not on mastering the rules, but on denying the building the one thing institutions love most. A clean, shared version of reality. Officially, nothing unusual happened at Evergreen. That was the line in the internal memo circulated 2 weeks after the archive incident. Temporary systems malfunction. Smoke was never confirmed. Certain overnight staff had resigned for personal reasons. Some restricted collections would remain closed pending review. Public programming would resume on schedule. The language was familiar in exactly the way that made me hate it. Several employees did resign. Others simply stopped appearing in schedules without corresponding termination paperwork. When I checked older staff directories, I found gaps shaped like people I knew had existed. A preparator from journals. A collections assistant Harold had once mentioned by first name and never again. One of the conservators who had gone below with my father, maybe. The institution had resumed editing itself. Harold stayed, though he looked reduced by the choice. Priya left after training a replacement for first aid protocols she insisted were ordinary. Owen stayed another month, then vanished in the benign modern sense. No forwarding address, phone disconnected, social media gone quiet. Amelia took unpaid leave and sent me one postcard from New Mexico with no return address. Just a drawing of a museum floor plan on the back with every room unlabeled. I remained, partly for my father. That sounds noble and may even contain a piece of truth. Mostly I stayed because once you know a place can rewrite the confidence of the people inside it, trust in outside management becomes difficult. The museum was going to keep operating. School groups were going to keep pressing fingerprints onto the case glass. Donors were going to keep funding acquisitions they didn't understand. I no longer believed walking away would sever my relation to it. It would only leave the night shift to people who still thought all institutions were what they claimed. The museum reopened in autumn after a quiet renovation of 2 lower halls and a public messaging campaign about enhanced interpretation and accessibility. They changed several exhibits, retired some labels, and opened a new gallery of reconstructed basin finds with language so carefully provisional it read like legal testimony. I helped write none of it. Harold made sure of that. What I did receive on the first night of the new schedule was an updated employee handbook for overnight security. There were now 5 rules instead of 4. The first 4 on my card had been reworded, subtly but unmistakably, as if someone had translated them through too many drafts. The 5th was typed in a slightly different font. If another guard tells you their rules match yours, leave the building immediately. Beneath the list in the authorization line was my signature. I stared at it for a full minute before my breathing changed. It was my signature, not a close imitation, not an institutional forgery. My actual hand, or something that knew the pressure pattern, the shortened tail on the D, the way I never fully closed the loop on the R. I had no memory of signing it. When I showed Harold, he read the card without visible surprise. "Do you remember approving this?" I asked. "No. That doesn't bother you?" He looked at me for a long moment. "Lucas, if I answered that honestly, we'd need to compare definitions of bother." That was as close to humor as he got anymore. I kept the new card in my wallet behind the old photograph. Over time, the 2 items began to feel related in a way I couldn't articulate. My father caught mid-turn. My own name authorizing a rule I didn't remember learning. Evidence of a continuity I had not consented to. Months passed. Not peacefully, but with enough routine to tempt denial. The museum at night remained wrong in local ways. Occasional missing labels, display glass colder than the room, voices in the ductwork that sounded like overlapping tour guides. But the intimate mimicry lessened. Or perhaps I had simply grown better at refusing it. I stopped checking twice when reflections resembled me. I stopped counting anything that invited count. I stopped using names over the radio when a description would do. The new guards learned their own habits. I did not ask what rules they had been given. Then, in late winter, a newly opened exhibit appeared off the East Corridor during a week when no opening was scheduled. That sentence reads impossible. In practice, it was worse because it arrived with administrative texture. Temporary signs, fresh paint smell, a discreet plaque stand. The kind of moderate planning that makes people accept absurdity because absurdity has apparently gone through facilities. The exhibit space had once housed rotating education displays. Now the entry sign read, "Recent acquisitions, identity and reconstruction." I stood outside the threshold longer than I should have. The room beyond was lit more softly than the surrounding galleries. One central display case,